As we just had July 4th, I thought it would be fun. I say fun, it might be boring for some of you. I thought it'd be fun to ask this question: was it biblical for America to rebel against England? This is an old question, and it has answers to it. And you have scholars on both sides of this particular issue. Dylan and I, when Dylan was here, when Dylan was still with us, Dylan and I talked a lot about this, and Dylan had very strong views on this particular issue. And as it is July 4th weekend, I thought it'd be fun to tackle this and to consider it. Maybe consider the arguments from a new perspective. So here are the arguments. Some Christians, the scholars, say this: Christians do not have the right to rebel against the authority that God put in place. Actually, as Dan just read a little while ago, thus it was not biblical for America to rebel. You understand that? Here's the argument for saying that it is biblical. God allowed Israel to repel her enemies, so as Christians, we also have the right, and thus it was biblical for America to rebel. So those are the arguments.
Both sides.
Yeah, both sides that you'll see from scholars. And books have been written. There's been a lot of debate. I don't think it's a particularly hot subject now. Dylan was definitely on the side of it was not biblical for America to rebel. And then I was talking to him about, well, maybe America could get back in with Britain or what. And it was an interesting conversation. And we both wound up, after much discussion on this topic, we both wound up at the same place, which is where we're headed today. And just so you know, we're going to wind up a place that is not either of these. I will try to make the case today that both of these arguments have a fatal flaw, but we won't get into that yet. It will unfold before us. We do have to consider, what is America? And as we are all Americans here, we've all been to school, and fascinatingly enough, we homeschool, and I'm a former history teacher at Northland Christian High School. So I love history, and I have read many, many books on the subject of America and dealing with Indians. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Alan Eckert. He was an author, historian, an extremely well-studied historian, and he wrote a series of historical books about America. So it was fascinating. But I've been teaching my kids this whole last week. Our homeschool started back up, and I've been teaching them all week long at the behest of my lovely wife here. I've been teaching them about the history of America. And of course, if you're going to learn about the history of America, what's the one place you start? Anybody? Anyone want to venture a guess?
Oh, the Pilgrims, right?
Okay, Pilgrims. Anybody else?
The Chinese or the Vikings.
Okay. Anybody else? Josh is getting...
Across the Bering Strait.
Oh, wait, what was that?
Land bridge across the Bering Strait.
Okay, Lance is getting us even closer.
Or do you want to start back at Pangaea and follow the tectonic plates shifting?
Okay, now you've gone even further back than I went. I only wanted to do with human history and not geological epics or whatever. So that was awesome, though. Thank you, Lance. The Tower of Babel. So yeah, actually the land bridge is a phenomenal place to start as well. But so we started there and traced it. Interestingly enough, on Monday we started there, and on Friday we went over the Declaration of Independence. So it was great. So in 5 short days we spanned thousands of years. So it was fun. But we're posed with this question of, and this is an important question, what is America? What exactly is America? The Americas became a land of wonder, opportunity, and freedom from oppression for many Europeans. Now, for those of you that don't know, Columbus died thinking that he had been to India and China. He didn't realize that this was a new world, and America was named after Amerigo Vespucci, who claimed that, no, this is a whole new continent that we don't know of, that we didn't know about. And thus we are named from his Latin, the Latin version of Amerigo, which would be Americus, which is America, and here we are. But as explorers came over, and colonists came over, and tales of new land, and tales of opportunity or religious freedom, or get away from all the garbage that's happening in Europe, just really inspired people from around the globe, and continues, I should say, continues to inspire people from around the globe to come here. And I'll say this about the people that came here and the people that still continue to come here. They're an interesting group of people because they're brave. They are rugged individuals in that they left the comfort of their country to come to some new place. So these are brave people that make a treacherous journey, and they come for different reasons, but they all come to America, a land of wonder, a land of opportunity, a land to break free from the tyranny of Europe, a land to come and freely exercise your religion without getting involved in the religious wars or the religious persecution. Or a lot of the way that land was handed down to the oldest son in total. And the younger sons would get money, but not land. And a lot of younger sons would find their fortune coming to the New World. Companies, joint stock companies, companies where people put their money together, came to America. They funded, even the Pilgrims on the Mayflower were funded by a company that was looking to make money. So we have to really think, what is America exactly? The people that came from Europe were fleeing a Europe that was tearing itself apart. The Protestant Reformation of the 1500s spawned the religious wars, the 30-Year War, and other various wars between Catholic and Protestant/Reform. So you have this destruction of Europe from within, where Christians are killing each other in the name of their faith, where Jesus said, "Put away your sword, for those who live by the sword shall die by the sword." They took up the sword. And from without, in the east, the Muslims were coming in, and they were eventually, by 1683, going to make it all the way to Vienna. And in the midst of all this, you had monarchs who had the divine right of kings, which you may have heard of the divine right of kings. In fact, Dan read again, Romans 13. God has appointed them to rule, and so these European kings had that in mind, had Romans 13 in mind when they said, I have a divine right to be king, and I will be an absolute monarch. And this really rubbed a lot of people the wrong way because these monarchs became despots, tyrants. And so in the early 1700s, you have the rise of philosophers who are, you always have philosophers. So, but these philosophers are talking about the way things are being run in Europe and how it's not just, and it becomes the age of Enlightenment, which we'll cover here a little bit more. And so these new ideas are happening. People want to flee what's going on in Europe, find a new start, make a new way where they have no opportunity, or there's war, or they just have had it. They leave and come to America for many different reasons. The colonists were still subject to their respective European sponsors, whatever nation they came from. Some of them had autonomy at some times. They had a little provisional government, and at other times it was tyranny, even in the colonies. So you could run from Europe, but really Europe still has a hand on your back, patting you at some times. At other times, a hand on your throat. But they all came to America, a land of promise and hope. That's the Europe that they fled. And a lot of our forefathers fled England. So it's fascinating. We'll focus on that. We're not really going to get much into the Dutch or Spanish or French so much. We're going to talk about the British colonies. So the first British colony was established 4 years before the King James Version was published. Pretty fascinating. Jamestown, Virginia, 1607. In 1620, the Pilgrims on the Mayflower fled the heavy hand of the Church of England. Now, the Church of England, you have to understand something. At the Church of England, as it is now, the king or queen is the head of church and state. That is the whole debate about church and state. When you're leaving a country where where your country split away from the Roman Catholic Pope and replaced the Pope with the sovereign of your nation, it's like you have another Pope. And if you're in disagreement with that new Pope, who is also the political power, the sole political power, then you want to get away from that. Now, they were being funded by an English company who wanted to make money off of them. And, in order to... It's not so easy to get people to go that don't want to go. And these particular people wanted to go, and some entrepreneurs wanted to go as well, but they left and they fled. And some were fleeing, and some were happily going, thinking, man, we're going to make money. Of course, they were headed for Virginia, but wound up in Massachusetts. Yeah. In 1630, the Puritans left for the same reason. They did not want to be part of the Church of England, and they came for religious freedom, and also entrepreneurs with them. But even though many left England for religious reasons, there were people that left for business. They wanted to make money. They wanted a new start. They wanted land. Especially something when... Think about England itself. There's limited land in England. And at this time, the sun never sets on the English Empire, as they have colonies in nearly every continent. But they lived in a world, all of these people lived they had a common experience coming from Europe and being in the New World. They lived in a world of fellow Christians. Now, they may be divided with each other, but it was nonetheless a very Christian world, even though they were doing horrendous things to each other in the name of our Lord, who was humble even to death on a cross, and who never called any Christian to go and kill, as Israel served to be the hand of judgment against the Canaanites. Jesus never said, he said, go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. He didn't say, go into all the world and make disciples of all nations, and if they don't become my disciple, then kill them. He never said such a thing. In fact, the instruction that he gave to the 70 is, if somebody didn't want to listen to you, if the town rejected you, shake the dust off your sandals and go on. So what we have the right to do as Christians is to shake the dust off our sandals. That's a pretty violent act. Not really. But it is a Christian world. But it's not just Christians. It's not just people coming here for religious freedom. They're coming here for opportunity. They're coming here to make a better life for themselves. Here's a nice little picture of people coming to the new land. And look how... I like this picture. I enjoy these types of pictures. Is there a...
kind of touching on it, but there was, still have records of it, people that were preaching, or starting around this time and continuing forward in the 1700s, that the Americas were like the Israel for Christians.
Right.
They should treat all the Native Americans like the Canaanites.
Right.
That was a whole issue.
Yep. And this is the promised land, and we are now the city on the hill, and that sort of thing. But those aren't the only people coming here. And as we move further along to the age of Enlightenment, you see it's over 100 50 years before we start to see the revolution happen. It's been 150 years or so of time has passed. And in the age of enlightenment, there are certain philosophers, a lot of philosophers, and really fun reads, I might say. But such philosophers as John Locke, Thomas Paine, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who I had my students read some of his works and write an 8-page paper on it, which they were not happy to get. And I was very happy to give them because it was such a cool paper. And then when I got the papers back from my students, my wife laughed at me because she realized I was stupid and didn't realize I'd have to read them all.
And grade them all.
And grade them all. Yeah, that was fun. But these philosophers are reacting to the absolute monarchs of Europe. And they are putting ideas out there into the heads of Europe and any colonies that came from Europe. These ideas of self-government and natural law, God-given rights of life, liberty, and property. And you have Christianity and Judaism and deism all working together, somewhat blurring the lines between religion and philosophy and patriotism and politics. Ideas and words coming in common for everyone to use, and we all know what we're saying. Bruce?
Hey, Jeremy, where is in the Bible, is there a God-given right to property?
Well, you see, you're hitting on part of the problem. As you read these philosophers, they make excellent political points. They truly do. They really do. The equality of man and the sovereign gets their right to rule from the governed. And these are all political arguments. And but you're not going to find a lot of these ideas in the Bible, Bruce. You're just not going to find them. Now, the Bible doesn't necessarily have to touch on every political idea in order for people to have an opinion about it that might be right. So the Bible doesn't exhaustively cover all of that. But what's happened here is that it's a Christian society that's also influenced by Judaism and deism, a religion of the Enlightenment era in which God exists and He created the universe and He set everything in motion, and when he put it to active mode, He walked away. People often say He wound up the clock and now the clock is unwinding in the way in which God intended, but He no longer is going to be actively involved in what we're doing. So you have this religious ideas swirling together and interjecting themselves where wanted and where needed into political philosophy. And so by this time, we are quite a bit past the Pilgrims. The Puritans have had children and grandchildren. And if you read about the history of them, you see that their children and grandchildren don't see things the way that they do. And the idea of the city on the hill in New England was kind of fading, as the resolve of their offspring was not as strong as theirs. But this philosophy is using God-given rights and natural laws and inalienable rights that nothing can be taken away, for they are given by God. These ideas. And the colonial leadership was heavily influenced by these philosophers. I mean, these philosophers made excellent points, and they could point to any number of situations and say, see what that monarch is doing? That monarch is a tyrant. So let's take a look at some excerpts from the Declaration of Independence. And while you didn't really get an exhaustive study of Enlightenment philosophy here, I went through the whole Declaration except for the points that they made, where he was making out these are the things that you did. In the other paragraphs, I took excerpts out that really screamed of Enlightenment philosophy and made me wonder if they might have been, some of them, word for word quotations or even perhaps just a loose quotation, the ideas of enlightenment are here in the Declaration. It becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. When in the course of history it becomes necessary, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to separation. Separate and equal laws of nature, nature's God. These ideas are coming from Enlightenment philosophy. We hold these truths to be self-evident. You could have self-evident truths in the age of Enlightenment, and they are appealing to that. So we hold these truths to be self-evident. Everyone should know this. All men are created equal. Equality is another big hallmark of Enlightenment philosophy. That they are endowed by their Creator. God interjected here again, as in the previous quote. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are Enlightenment ideals. The governments, here's this good one, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. My goodness, most of the Enlightenment philosophers said this. This turns the divine right of kings on its head. You derive your power from the people. And here's a good one, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government. It's the right of the people. And this is arguments that a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers made. I like this one. But when a long train of abuses... Now, this first quote was preceded by, it's understandable if a government has to do things for a short period of time and be a little bit tyrannical for a short period of time and then step away. He said, that's fine. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. I like this next one. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of the free people. Which I broke out my copy of The Prince by Machiavelli, and I thought, I wondered if that was a quote from in there. I didn't go track it down, but of course Machiavelli was a Renaissance philosopher. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. They're, again, appealing to God. They're making Enlightenment arguments, and they're appealing to God. And they're interjecting God in here many places. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, God again, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. These men were willing to die for this cause. Oops. These men were willing to die for this cause. Here's a picture of some men, Samuel Adams. Notice that Samuel Adams on the upper left corner is not on a bottle of beer at the moment, fascinatingly enough. So we have Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Thomas Jefferson.
The one has very interesting hair.
Well, which one? I think the one that's not wearing a wig, or the ones that aren't wearing a wig? That's a wig.
I know, but the way they did it is just weird. Looks like a piece of foam on there. Cut out.
It's like a mushroom. Yeah, it's a scalp fungus was very big back in those days. That's bad. They did not quote the Bible as a support for their rebellion, but they quoted Enlightenment philosophical ideas as support for their rebellion. These truths are self-evident. They appealed to, as Bruce pointed out, we don't see in the Bible I mean, do we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Now it was property. I mean, John Locke is writing about life, liberty, and property all the time. And that was the original wording that they were going to put in there, but they changed it to pursuit of happiness, or Thomas did, or somebody asked him to, or he thought to. I don't remember what the story was on that, but they are appealing to Enlightenment philosophy to establish their nation. So is there biblical support for the American Revolution, is the question. But I don't think that's a good first question. Let's ask another. Is there a difference between the church and America? I think that's a much better question. I think most people start out with the assumption that as this was, that we see the Pilgrims coming over, the Puritans coming over, and a lot of people coming over for religious freedom early on, 1600s, and the Reformation was still fresh on everyone's mind, and the struggle between, I mean, goodness gracious, the 30 Years' War between Catholic and Protestant, when it suited them, I should say. These things are on everybody's mind, but not everybody that's coming to America is like that. And so America is an amalgamation. America is not the church. The church is in America, but America itself is not the church. And this seems like a very simple thing to point out. Even as I say it now, it should be obvious to anybody that we can't write church and an equal sign and America and say that they are the same thing. So are you a Christian living in a secular nation or a Christian living in a Christian nation? There's another good question to ponder. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, when they first came here, the Pilgrims and then the Puritans, I guess, they probably said, well, yeah, we kind of like to have like maybe a theocracy.
Yes.
Form of government
Yep.
For us here in this new land. And so it was not really a Christian land. It was just Christians living in a new land, having thrown off the former, or having gotten away from the former government, the monarchies, which were not living by God's revealed will in the Old and New Testament.
Yeah. But they wanted to set up for themselves and their society a theocracy, which really what they were trying to set up was just a church. Like your life is a church. Everybody around you is in the same church, and you are ruled by the church leadership. But you're treating it like it's a political system. Is there even biblical support for a Christian nation when our only sovereign is Christ? That's another one to ponder.
What does Colossians 1:18 say?
Jesus is the head of the church. And there are many such verses as that. If it can be established that the Bible supports a Christian nation, then we will find no biblical support for such a nation going to war. So if the Bible even did say that you could have a Christian nation with a sovereign of the nation, which we don't, we only get the leaders of the church, elders and deacons. That's all we get. We don't get in order to establish. It's always the church responding to the government that they are living under. And it's never the church becoming the government that rules over secular powers or non-religious, non-believing powers. And even if such a nation could exist, Jesus didn't give us the right to go to war. And it is an absolutely taking it out of context to say, well, if Israel had the right to attack Canaanites, then the church has a right to attack Indians or whoever else, because they are the Canaanites, and we have that right. No, we do not get that right. And the Canaanites were attacked not because Israel was so good, but they were attacked because they were so bad. The Canaanites were absolutely horrendous. But there's no support for, Jesus saying, put away the sword. For those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And then the mandate that he gave them was to go and make disciples. There's no support for a Christian nation to go to war. So from that perspective, there would be no biblical support for America to go to war. But the question is America a theocracy? If it can be established that America is a secular nation, then there is plenty of biblical support for a nation to go to war, or a nation to rise against a nation. If it's a secular nation, that is, the question I posed on the previous slide, are you a Christian in a secular nation, or are you a Christian in a Christian nation? If you're a Christian in a secular nation, that secular nation indeed has the right to go to war. America is not a Christian nation. It was established upon and is ruled by secular documents and secular bodies. It's not ruled by elders. It's certainly impossible for it to be ruled by the apostles, for they are in glory. America is ruled by, it was founded on Enlightenment ideals. Yeah, a bunch of Christians they were, but the support for their being, their raison d'être, if I could sound all uppity, their reason to be was the Enlightenment ideas. The Bible does not sanction the existence of a Christian nation until Christ reigns. So, in that sense, if I can put it this way, America is not a Christian nation, for there can be no Christian nation until Messiah reigns in Jerusalem. It can be a nation filled with majority Christians. But that does not answer the question at hand. Saying that America is not a Christian nation, although I think it starts to lead us there.
Hey, Jeremy.
Yeah.
Can we jump forward way back into Revelation a little bit? Okay. So
No. The way you said that is horrible. You said, can we jump forward way back? Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
When Christ comes and sets up his millennial kingdom, it says, and here and there, a few verses here and there, that the nations will bring, their glory to him in Jerusalem.
Yep.
So there are going to be other nations besides Israel.
Yes.
Where Jerusalem will be, and where his throne will be, and yet his knowledge will cover the earth like
yes.
the oceans.
Yes.
Are surround the earth. I mean.
Yes.
Thing. So therefore, are those nations? Are they Christian? Will they be Christian nations at that time, or will they just be different nations with God's knowledge universally at your hand to refer to and to live by?
Well, this is an excellent question, and as it belongs in that, if I can use this word, Bruce, dispensation. And we're not in that particular situation, but in order to answer your question, I would say this. If the whole world is ruled by one sovereign that's over them all, a benevolent sovereign who is ruling with true justice and truth because he knows all things, and if all nations are subservient to him, then there really is only one sovereign. And so to say that every nation would be a Christian nation at that point, maybe a way to put it would be all nations are under Christ. And so you could, in a way, say that. But we do know that at the end there will be a rebellion, and so they're not all Christian, but they are being ruled by Christ himself. But that's not the situation we're in now. But what I want to look at is what sort of biblical support is there for a secular nation to go to war, or what does it look like? What is God doing with the secular nations? In Genesis, God used Egypt to save many people in a famine. In Joshua, God used Israel to punish the wicked Canaanites. And I would add this, my friends. When God first told Abraham back in Genesis 15 that in 400 years' time, Israel was going to come back and then Canaan would be punished. He said, for the sin of the Amorites has not reached its full measure. God had mercy on them for 400 years as they became more and more wicked. In Judges, God used the nations as Israel was used to punish the nations. God uses the nations to punish Israel because of Israel's wickedness. Psalm 33 shows that God thwarts the nation's plans. Isaiah 10 is an excellent chapter. It talks about how God uses nations in general but how he's going to use Assyria to punish Judah in the same way that he used Assyria or similarly to the way he used Assyria to punish the northern kingdom of Israel. But then he said Assyria is going to go too far, and they're going to be destroyed. In 2 Chronicles 36 and in many other places, it shows that God brought the Babylonians against Judah, and God brought the Babylonians against Assyria to defeat Assyria. God revealed his plan for the nations to Nebuchadnezzar in the statue. The very statue that Nebuchadnezzar saw showed how the major global powers were going to unfold. And has one power, whereas Babylon is defeated by the Persians, is defeated by the Greeks, is defeated by the Romans, is defeated by the 10 toes. It's fascinating. God used Rome to punish Israel in 70 AD, as Jesus and Daniel both predicted would happen. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. Now, this was not in the Bible. I have it under the biblical support slide. This didn't happen in the Bible, but it was prophesied in the Bible. So God uses the nations to bring about his will. And Satan, if we can go forward, back to Revelation, Satan is said in chapter 20, he deceives the nations. Now the Declaration of Independence, so if we think in terms of America being a secular nation, the Declaration of Independence lists off 27 pieces of evidence that point to the 27 different statements that point to the tyrannical oppression of King George III, and I guess I could have put 28, because he also pointed to how the British people themselves, how they had appealed to the British people themselves, their own brothers, and how their own brothers refused to help them and turned a deaf ear to them. So they gave out points of, these are the reasons we're doing it. And these are real tangible things that you know have been going on, we know have been going on, and this is why we're doing it. Now based on, yeah.
I posted a link that David found that has an annotation of the Declaration of Independence, and it gives the historical background for each one of their pieces of evidence, if anybody's interested in looking at it.
Oh, yeah.
It's the actual laws and rules and the specifics behind what each grievance came from.
That is great. Thank you. I think that's really cool. And you know what that is? That's context. My favorite word. Everything must be taken in context. I've been reading the speeches of King George III lately, too, for fun. That's so boring. I'm sorry if this is a boring thing. But based on God's biblical examples of nations and his word, God likely used the colonies to punish the despotism of King George III and of England. Otherwise, I think the Americans would have lost. And so this is consistent with what we see God doing in the Bible and in history, but it in no way makes America a Christian nation, but one that used to acknowledge him, or in cases still does, because there's so many of us here that do. But it doesn't make it a Christian nation from that theocratic standpoint. Other potential historical support for what God does with nations. God used the uncouth European tribes and the Muslims to bring down the Western and Eastern Roman empires. And then he brought the Mongols to punish everybody for a short time. And then he used Europe to punish the Islamic Empire for all the murder that they were doing. We see this back and forth movement in this period, and we're still in that period. God used Napoleon to overturn the tyrants of Europe. You want to talk about the embodiment of Enlightenment ideals gone awry, though. You look at the French Revolution, and they wound up with another tyrant in place of the tyrant. But he helped overthrow a lot of tyrants in Europe, but then for his tyranny, he was overturned by England eventually. We can see that God used the North to punish the South in the Civil War, for the South lost. God used the Allies to punish the wickedness of Nazi and Japanese imperialism and genocide. God used the Allies to bring down the tyranny of Soviet Russia and put communist China on notice. And we can say that the recent shaking of America since 9/11 is God's way of bringing nations against an increasingly wicked America, for we have been shaking ever since then. It's been fascinating to see. But all of these events are taking place in kingdoms that precede the Antichrist, and so God is still moving. And he may bring an evil nation to do bad things to you, but from a eternal perspective, it's part of God's plan. And there's a reason for it. It was either so that...
Jeremy.
Yes.
So why don't we see all this kind of back and forth upheaval like in Africa or especially in Central Latin America? I mean, it seems like they just kind of live their lives and they fly under the radar for decades and decades and decades, and nothing ever happens down there.
Oh, I think there's plenty of upheaval down there. Certainly, from a historical perspective, they had to throw off the Spanish and also the Portuguese. But I would...
Way back in the 1800s, you know?
Right. Yeah. But we're also dealing with major players. So one might look at it this way. What was going on in Europe during the time of the rule of the Assyrians? The Bible doesn't spend much time on that, if at all. Or I think nothing, really.
Yeah.
Greece is referred to as one day they're going to come, but I don't think it was very important. Now, if you want to get into something that is fascinating, something that Hippolytus, who is the disciple of Irenaeus, the disciple of Polycarp, the disciple of John, Hippolytus said in his day, Rome, we were living in the legs of the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's statue, but he knew that after him would come the 10 toes mixed with clay and iron, so that the divided peoples they'd have some of the strength of Rome, but never strong enough to have the total domination that Rome had. And he talked about those 10 existing for a long time after him, once Rome finally fell. And so if you're talking about, and this would be a fascinating book to write, and I'm not going to write it. And I do want to say this, I'm not a prophet. I could be wrong on some of these things I'm saying here. I'm just looking at what I saw God do in the Bible and trying to analyze in history, why did God allow certain people to win? Why did he bring people against other people? And what was the outcome of it? It's easier to look at in retrospect, but I am not a prophet to say God told me that this is exactly it. It just appears that way. And so if we're talking about 10 toes, Bruce, then it's going to be the 10 important nations that are going to be focused on, and not so much smaller conflicts, although you can lump them under nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There's a lot of turmoil in all of those areas.
Yeah, don't forget now, in this vision that Daniel had, like the statue, I mean, it was a human being. And so when we get down into the 10 toes, some of iron and some of clay, to me, that's just, that could be like NATO. Where the United States is like the iron in the NATO alliance, and the other European countries, like maybe 26 countries other besides United States that make up NATO, those could be the clay, because it seems like they don't spend any money on defense like we do, and they don't project military power like we can, and so that's, to me, this is like just a picture of what we see today, how there's like one superpower, namely the United States, which has all this money dedicated and success in developing all these super weapons, and their all allies are just like clay. But it doesn't necessarily mean literally that there are only 9 other countries that are that are involved in this whole thing that we see right now between the iron and the clay.
Well, that's an interesting hypothesis.
It's just a figure.
Yeah, and you know what, honestly, that's all any of us can do is come up with some kind of hypothesis about the situation. The one thing I do like about what Hippolytus said is that from his perspective, it was going to be, in fact, what he literally said is, there is nothing so powerful and weak as a democracy. And so he saw the 10 toes as being 10 successive democracies who will exist during each other's time, but will go from one to the other. And so I found it a fascinating hypothesis that he had, in that Rome is going to have an end, and after them will come these nations that have some strength but are also divided. And I can see that in America right now. What a divided place we are in terms of iron and clay. Yes, there's a lot of strength in America, but at a moment's notice we could be at civil war with each other and tear ourselves apart and not do things that we could do. America could dominate the world in many ways and pay dearly for it. Or other nations could do the same. So, but whether it's a NATO or the European Union, I don't know. I don't know. God is using nations, and America could be another one of those nations. So it was biblical. It was biblical for America to rebel in the same way that God's use of other nations is biblical. But there is no biblical mandate for Christians to form a nation, only for Christians to follow God. Or for nations, sorry, only for nations to follow God. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. Psalm 33:12. And that is in the same way a nation can follow God. Remember when Joshua was talking to the angel of the Lord, or the hosts, the captain of the Lord's hosts, and he asked him, and as he was standing outside of Jericho, looking down on Jericho, and he asked him, "Are you on our side or are you on Jericho's side?" And the angel said, "Neither. I'm on God's side." So the question isn't, is God on our side or is God on their side? It's, are we on God's side? But even that doesn't make a nation a Christian nation, because there is no biblical mandate for a theocracy to exist. So I will make the argument that the two arguments for and against are incorrect, because they're assuming that the church is equal to America when the church exists in America, but America is not the church. It is correct to say that America's founding was influenced by Christian men, and it's correct to say that, according to Pew Research, 65% identify as Christian in this nation, but not that it has a biblical mandate to form a Christian nation, for no such place can biblically exist. We see the Roman Catholic Church did this. They did form a theocracy. They are in a theocracy to this day. But it is not biblical. It is not biblical, and it has caused them much harm to be so involved with politics. It has harmed them greatly, and indeed one of the things that led to the Reformation. So what about the Christian and America? America's founding documents, fathers, and other works make many references to God. There were a bunch of references to God in the Declaration of Independence. And many of the founding fathers were also Christians, devout Christians, but not so devout Christians, and some were deists and some were Jewish. Some American patriotic songs also refer to God, because God has always been used in American literature. And the national motto, as of the 1900s, 1950s, I believe, the national motto is "In God We Trust." And we have in the Pledge of Allegiance, also from the 1950s, "One nation under God," which was perhaps a reaction to the atheist Russia, the atheist communist Russia. And so to show ourselves, well, we are not atheists, we believe in God. And certainly the nation can say that. But saying something and doing something are two different things. Politicians, we see it frequently. Politicians in both parties invoke God when it is expedient to them and their careers, and claim Him as being on their side, as if the Republicans and Democrats could say, "God's on our side. It's Joshua." No, God is not. God is on His side. Question is, are you on their side? And here's another thing. Our fathers, grandfathers, and forefathers fought wars, and some died so that we could enjoy the freedom and opportunity here in America. My grandfathers both fought, and my dad's dad was ready to die. He did 6 beach landings in the Pacific, and he was going to be in one of the first waves to go to Japan. And they heard the stupidest story they ever heard, that one bomb was going to fix the whole war. It was the dumbest thing he'd ever heard, and it was just wishful thinking, but it happened, and here I am. So we feel a solemn debt of gratitude to these men and women that fought. We feel that as Americans. And indeed, it is worthy to keep a land free for the purpose of spreading the truth. God has used America as a tool of judgment, and He's also brought judgment upon it from time to time. But the Christian in any nation, as Dan read in Romans 13, we are to obey the ruling authority. We are to do what is right. We're to pay them financial tribute, taxes, and honor. They do wield the sword. Acts 5:28 through 29 does show that when the government orders you to do what is evil, you obey God over mankind. Philippians 3:20, we are citizens of heaven. 2 Corinthians 5:20, we are ambassadors for Christ. Heaven's embassy is amongst the nations. When you're an ambassador, you're a foreigner in a land. So in any nation, if you truly are an ambassador for Christ, then you truly are a foreigner in that land from that perspective. Paul did use his Roman citizenship when faced by the authorities. He used it to his benefit. We see that in Acts 16 and in Acts 22. So you are an American citizen as well, and you can use that to your benefit when necessary. But Paul did implore the believers not to take each other to the secular courts. He said, why on earth would you go have men who are not going to inherit the kingdom of heaven and a whole list of things that they're like? Why are you going to let them settle your disputes and not take care of it in the church? So we shouldn't be taking each other to American court. Doesn't mean you can't go to court. Somebody else could, some non-believer could take you to court, or even a believer could take you to court. Maybe the first thing you should do is say, let's sit down and go through 1 Corinthians 6 together. We're supposed to pray for the leaders and for peace, for our sake, so that we can live in peaceful times and so that the gospel can spread. That's the main thrust of 1 Timothy 2, that passage. Pray for the leaders. Pray that there'll be peace in your land, and so that the gospel can spread. So we are ambassadors for Christ, and we are citizens of heaven while we're here in America, but there is no biblical mandate for a Christian nation in that sense. Now, a nation that's influenced by Christians, sure, I think that's perfectly fine to say, but we don't have a right to have a theocracy. Christ is our only sovereign. We are sojourners in a land that is not our own, and we look forward to His return. So, from that perspective, those arguments at the beginning that were saying the church doesn't have the right to go to war, or saying that the church did have the right to go to war, that's the wrong argument, because America is the first Enlightenment nation to exist. The very first. And it was born out of the Enlightenment and born out of great tyranny and a reaction to tyranny. And so from that perspective, America, as a secular nation, had every right, as they wield the sword, they had every right to defend themselves against the tyrant. And God had every right to use them to punish the tyrannies of the monarchs. And we saw it. The 1700s to 1800s, so many monarchies overturned because of their wickedness.